Good evening. Thank you for joining us. My name is Sarah Zenaida Gould, and I'm the Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. Welcome to tonight's MACRI Talk. Tonight we are joined by Dr. David Dorado Romo, author of a new book, Borderlands and the Mexican American Story, which is this book right here. And let me tell you a little bit about our special guest. Dr. Romo is a writer, translator, musician, and historian from the American Southwest. He's a fronterizo, a person who grew up and lives on the border between Mexico and the United States. Steeped in the fronterizo spirit that strongly defines the attitudes of the US-Mexico border region, he conducted a 4-year search to document the important history of the El Paso, Juarez region. That book resulted in this wonderful book, The Ringside Seat to the Revolution, an underground cultural history of El Paso, which is, and El Paso and Juarez, 1893 to 1923. This is a really fantastic book if you can get your hands on it. And it has been described as a vital historical work for the Southwest. He's also the author of this book, Remembering Duranguito, which is a walking tour of an old neighborhood, an old Mexican neighborhood in El Paso. Really great book. I'm so glad I was able to pick this up from you earlier this year. And now, of course, this book that is designed for middle school readers. And I will just tell you, I read it and I loved it. So I think it's for more than middle school readers, but that is who it's specifically designed for. Also, I just want to say that he is a former MACRI Talk presenter. He last appeared with us in July of 2022 for a talk that we called El Paso's Historic El Segundo Barrio. And I'll put a link to that in the chat so people can watch it later. But welcome back, Dr. Romo.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, well, I have to say it's really exciting to have you back because your new book is racking up awards. Can you just tell us a little bit about, I think I saw School Library Journal, Kirkus Review's Best Book of the Year?
Yeah, I mean, it's getting out there. Kirkus and what is it? The Scholastic Library Journal both put it on the list for the Best Book of the Year 2024. And I know I just got a message that it also won the Best Book award. And it's at the top of my head, but I can't remember it.
That's okay. That's okay. Yeah, well, that's fantastic. This book, I would just like for you to tell us about the origins of the project, because I was telling you before we went live that MACRI created a list of books for young readers that have a Mexican American civil rights history focus, and our list is not that long. So what brought you to this project?
That we absolutely need more books that emphasize the importance of civil rights history among the Mexican American community. I wanted to specifically emphasize the protagonist role of young people, so even children and teenagers, because most serious history books usually leave young people out of the picture, right? Perhaps, I mean, of course, those books that have focused on the school walkouts of Los Angeles in terms of the civil rights movement, but I wanted to do it for the long range story of the Mexican American community. And so, I think a lot of people are telling me, especially the older generation, man, I wish this book would have existed when I was going to school, because there's just a complete lack of knowledge. Most official history books, in the school system, don't do Mexican American history justice by any means.
Yeah. And it's a real problem. I think, something that we say, and this really comes more from Hollywood, but if you can't see it, how can you be it? And that's, just a little slogan that is used to talk about the lack of representation and particularly in Hollywood. But I think it applies to so many things.
Mhm.
When young people don't know that other young people from previous generations stood up for what they thought was right, then maybe they don't know that, what, I could do that too.
Absolutely. And sometimes adults might think that their struggles are not as important. So there's a couple of struggles that I deal with in my book during everything is the civil rights period, but the civil
Mm-hmm.
rights period is usually seen as the 60s, 70s, what have you. And one of them was in Crystal City in the late 60s, early 70s, and that was the Crystal City student walkout. And the issue was cheerleaders. At that time, there were four cheerleaders allowed in the squad. Only one of them could be brown or Mexican American. The other three had to be Anglos. And there was one particular cheerleader, Mexican American cheerleader, that was very, very good. And everybody thought, they should kind of change the rules a little bit so that we can have two brown girls and two Anglo girls being in the cheerleader squad. And the principal refused, and then the superintendent refused, and it turned into like this major revolt, right? That ended up just people saying, wait a minute, why aren't there more Chicano books in the library? Or why aren't there more Chicano teachers? While we're at it, why aren't there any Chicano mayors, right? So it started with something that apparently was relatively trivial, but that's how the story got to the minds and emotions of the young people. And then
Right.
something bigger, right? So I try to look at these things that maybe other historians might say, well, that's not important in the big scheme of things. But
Mm-hmm.
it was to them. But if you put it in a context, a bigger context, you see why it was so important.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to go back to this book for a minute, the book about the Mexican Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
This book, one of the things that is so remarkable about it is how you dug into a very, we might call it a difficult history of the treatment of people crossing the border into El Paso from Juarez to work. They had daily jobs in El Paso, and they had to experience some serious humiliations. And you explain that in great detail, and then you bring that story into this book.
Mm.
And I'm just wondering, what are the challenges for taking a story, that a piece of real history that is so inhumane, and make it accessible, but I guess appropriate for middle schoolers? Was that something that you had to think through? How do I do this?
Absolutely. I mean, to begin with, Ringside Seat to the Revolution, my first book, wasn't really academic to begin with. It was readable for adults.
Mhm.
But how do you make the story appropriate for a younger audience? And I think 13 is the minimum age that I would recommend this book for, because there are some heavy subject matters, and this is one of them: the fumigation of border crossers, going from, in this case, from Ciudad Juarez to El Paso, and facing just these terrible stories. This was a story that was told to me when I was in high school by my great aunt who went through it. And I remember the specific detail was that she had just bought some brand new shoes, and when she had to put her shoes in this big secadora, this steam dryer, when the U.S. Customs agents gave it back to her, they had been melted. And that little detail captured my mind, like I said, while I was still in high school. And it was inconceivable to me at that time that nobody had told me this story.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, some of these stories are very heavy, and possibly potentially even traumatic if told in a certain way. But at the same time, I think young people are already experiencing that. I mean, during the Mexican Revolution, it was young people that were often literally on the front lines, and they would bear the brunt of the suffering. So I think they have the right to know. And
Mhm.
story shouldn't be kept from them.
Right.
Yeah. We did have this discussion of what they should know, because most of the literature takes the root of celebration. And so my book has elements of celebration, especially for the artists, for the young people that have incredible resiliency. It finishes with celebration of the art that you find in our communities. But I think you also have to tackle these subjects that could potentially open a wound, but you need it in order to heal. And I think the younger you start dealing with this, the better. That's just my opinion.
Yeah. I wanted to also sort of step back to the very beginning of the book. One of the things that I found really remarkable about this is that of the books that I have seen for younger readers with a Mexican American focus, particularly Mexican American civil rights, they tend to start. I want to say the best example I can think of is the Duncan Toniatio book on Jose de la Luz Sáenz, which is about a man who served in World War One. But then the bulk of the books are set in the 60s. You start this book much, much earlier. How did you decide to do that? Mm-hmm.
I wanted to tell the story of an element of our own identities that has been minimized, and that's the indigenous identity.
Mm-hmm.
Even in the words that have been used to describe us, Hispanics, Latins, Latinx, it usually erases that indigenous element. And that everybody knows how traumatic it was for official Native Americans to go through these boarding schools. But Mexican Americans have also been denied the connection. They have not been allowed to connect with Native Brown America. And I start my story with these footsteps that were found in uh, New Mexico at White Sands. It's about 100 miles from El Paso, and it forced us to reconsider how long ago were the first natives to enter this continent. And they're 23,000 years old. And before that, most archaeologists thought that the first peoples were here about 12,000, 14,000 years ago. So for me, telling that story was important for many reasons. Well, first of all, most of those footprints, these 23,000-year-old native footprints, were made by young people, children. Why? Because they have so much energy and they like to jump and skip and slide in the mud. And that energy remained there until 23,000 years ago when the wind uncovered them and people uh, became aware of them. Right. So for me, that's a metaphor. So yeah, even where does our story begin? A lot of people, like you said, may start the story in the 1960s with the Chicano civil rights. Others often started in 1848 when what was Mexico becomes part of America, and that's when you get the Mexican American. But I think our story started way before that, and so I talk about this transnational migration that would go from Mesoamerica to what is now the Southwest, that has been going on for thousands of years, and how the people in Southwest, in the American Southwest, spoke different forms of Nahuatl, right? The Uto-Aztecan languages. All of that, to me, is very, very important because that's where the story of erasure begins. Our connection to the land, that we are indigenous. We don't give ourselves permission to reclaim our indigeneity because that's not something that's approved by the U.S. government, federal recognition. Unfortunately, even some of our indigenous brethren will say, no, you're not really fully indigenous. Well, I happen to disagree, and this book is setting out the reasons why I think we have every right to reclaim our indigeneity.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think especially because I think when you're 13, 14 years old, you're thinking a lot about who am I?
Yeah.
So this is a really good time for younger people to read it. But I have to say, I think even as an adult reading this, I was really, I was like, this is great. I'm glad we're talking about this here in a very accessible way. One of the interesting things about this book, and I'm imagine it was the publisher who writing or publishing books. This is a whole series. This is part of a series, Race to the Truth, from Crown Books, which is another achievement which we should talk about, getting published by a mainstream press. But after each chapter, I believe there's a little like discussion section, and so in some cases it's questions about why do you think this is. So in that first part, one of the questions is, why do you think that Mexican Americans' indigenous identity has been forgotten, or let me see, I want to get the language right, but 1 second, sorry, I lost my spot. Well, how were Mexican Americans forced or encouraged to forget their native origins? So I think it's some sort of a thoughtful way for people to contemplate that. And then in other places, you do things at the end of the chapter where you talk about the language and how Spanish and even in some cases indigenous language has influenced our culture and that and our experience. So I think it's a really nice way to pause and think about these things. So that's a really nice element to this book.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm so grateful that I got an opportunity to present what ultimately is complicated history in an accessible way. So I really was thinking how to explain everything, and my editors at Penguin Random House were very good. Like at one point, I talked about how after the Berlin Wall comes down in Germany, the American Wall goes up. And they told me, well, explain what the Berlin Wall is, because not everybody knows, especially at this level, right? They weren't born yet. So I appreciate also the help from my editors to make it as clear as possible. It's liberating. As you know, if you write for fellow people in academics, sometimes it gets way too insular. So there's an art to making it accessible without writing down to anyone, and still making it complicated, making deep connections, but in a way that everybody can understand.
Yeah. So because you decided to include a pretty long history from pre-Spanish times up to the present, how did you decide what was going to be included and what just, sorry, there's not enough space?
And so the idea that I presented to them, because there's 3 other books in this series, The Race to the Truth, and I saw how they presented it. And what I came up with is I wanted to, in every chapter, it was chronologically organized, but every chapter have a vignette that kind of tells you a story in a way that you can relate to it emotionally. I didn't want to just kids to know dates and names. Like I wanted one little vignette from, or a series of 3 vignettes. So when I'm looking at the civil rights period, most people look at Cesar Chavez. Tell me the names of some of the people that
Dolores Huerta, yes, and honestly, it's rarely beyond that.
Exactly, right? So I did mention them in the introduction because, of course, they're hugely important. I say these are the leaders that are usually talked about: José Ángel Gutiérrez, Reyes Tijerina, Dolores Huerta, etc. But I'm going to focus on some stories that you haven't heard about. So Severita Lara, remember I was talking about cheerleader revolt. She was a 17-year-old leader, fascinating story. And I really got deeply into how, she hung out with cousins in Los Angeles, how they organized, how she was a good friend of these Mexican American cheerleaders, all of that, right? In detail, so that it's more like a telenovela than your usual boring book about history, right? I wanted to capture the soul and the emotions and the chisme, all of that. So that's how I organized it. I chose about 3 vignettes per time period and focused on that, made it a little more human, more accessible.
Yeah. I see that somebody in the chat was asking about bad Mexicans, and I will just say we had a in-person talk about bad Mexicans the year that the book came out. But in your book, you do talk about the Flores Magon brothers, which I
Absolutely.
don't think I've ever seen anybody talk about for middle school readers. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, of course, Bad Mexicans is about the Flores Magon brothers and anarchy borders. So, of course, dealing with a topic like this and sounds like a whole bunch of chaotic bomb. Well, they weren't. They were these fascinating intellectuals that based their ideas not only on European ideas of how to create more human needs, but also very much inspired by indigenous people in their own communities and how they came here to the border because they thought the border was right kind of revolutionary movement. So they lived in Los Angeles, they lived in El Paso, they ended up having to escape all over. So how do you present these ideas to a young audience? Well, you explain it. You say, anarchism usually is seen as chaotic. Well, no, it wasn't about chaos. They wanted an organized society. They just wanted it to be more collective and less in terms of one person exploiting other people with orders. And it wasn't about just replacing one president with another. It really was a bottom up. So just explaining their ideas in a way it's probably something new, right? Because when people write for adults or for an academic audience, they get into the nitty gritty, their connections to Kropotkin or how the FBI started. I mean, a lot of times as academic historians, we just assume a knowledge that often isn't there. It's incredible because I'll tell people, this used to be, there were 10 states that used to be Mexico in what is now the American Southwest, and they'll scratch their heads. And I'm thinking, oh, darn, I got to start from the scratch, because it's not like this isn't common knowledge. So I guess that's the challenge of how do you tell these complicated stories to a young audience. And I don't know what you thought. Do you think it was accessible in how I told these stories?
I did. I just thought it was cool that you were in a way brave enough to introduce the Flores Magon to this audience, just because I think you're absolutely right. People hear the word anarchist and they have an idea, maybe. I mean, maybe if you're 13 years old, you don't even know what that means. But I think oftentimes people have an idea and then it's hard for them to understand actually these guys were intellectuals, as you said, that they we associate anarchist with some kind of bad radical or something instead of exactly bad Mexicans. And instead of these guys were really educated and yeah. One other interesting thing I think that this book does is it's a bit of an intervention, because when we do get books for middle readers about Mexican American topics, they're often California focused. And your book was not. And I just wonder, did you get any pushback to include more California or no?
I feel like I did include California. I included Arizona. I included, in some cases, Chicago. I was trying to. The Borderlands is not only San Diego, El Paso, Brownsville. To me, the Borderlands is a bigger concept. It's where there are these contact zones. and you can find these contact zones as far away as Chicago or San Francisco. So I definitely looked at like the Great Resistance that the people from Los Angeles, led by an Afro-Mexican American, against the U.S. invasion forces, for instance, or when I'm looking at the different Uto-Aztecan communities I talked about, or the so-called prehistoric native communities. I'm looking at California. So I'm trying to balance it out as much. But I mean, the truth is that I had already done so much research on El Paso, and there's so many stories that I came coming back to. One of these is Bowie High School. So that was the largest population, historically, the largest population of Mexican Americans in any high school up to like the 1940s. And so some of the stories that came out of there were like fascinating. So I would go back to that little micro history. It was a microcosm of the Mexican American community. So it was a school that was originally named by the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. It sent that was where like the Pachuco movement started, right? And then it went to California. People think that it's the other way around somehow.
Right.
They know about the Zoot Suit riots, but they don't know that El Chuco, as Tintan said, is the word that in the 1930s, 1940s was used for El Paso. Me voy pa'l Chueco. And that's where the term Pachuco comes from. So, and that was the school that sent Company E to World War II, right? It was one of the kind of most famous cases of almost a fully Mexican American combat unit that fought in World War II, and that's when they also fought. They took the Border Patrol, the students of Bowie High School, took the INS to court for racial profiling back in the early 1990s, and they beat the Border Patrol through litigation. So I choose these micro histories based on one particular spot, and that was what was originally called El Paso del Rio Norte, where 20 years before Plymouth Rock, it was the first group of European settlers that had their own Thanksgiving, which I call it Thanksgiving. And so all of these kind of unknown stories happen at that crossing. So yes, I do emphasize that part of the border more than others. But no, so far I haven't gotten any kind of
You know, if you want a like LA centric topic or Northern California, even there are other options. So I think that's okay.
I can tell you're a Tejana.
Yeah, it's okay. The other thing that I found really great about this book, and that I thought just adds to why this is important, is you have multiple moments in here of what we would call intersectionality, where you talk about Mexican Americans and African Americans, or Afro-Mexican American, or Afro-Mexicanos, I should say. Vicente Guerrero, you talk about as our first Black president, and but also the role in the Underground Railroad. So those are such important connections to make.
Absolutely, yeah, because you don't hear stories of historic alliances between Brown America and Black America, right? Mexican Americans. And the reason that slavery didn't thrive along the US-Mexico border is because of Mexican American solidarity, especially the Tejanos, and even like in the El Paso zone. There were a lot of people that are risking their own life and property to help enslaved African Americans escape south of the border, where Mexico had already abolished slavery under the first Afro-Mexicano president back in 1829. So you don't hear those stories of Black-Brown solidarity. You often just hear more contemporary stories of where sometimes they're competing for the same. There's this story that Mexican Americans never participated in the civil rights, that it was mostly a Black American thing, and that they're just kind of jumping on board and getting the privileges without having at all participated. And I mean, if that's the only story they've heard, that's why people say that. But it's not true. I mean,
Hmm.
the struggle for intersectional rights and alliances is there. It's just not told.
Right, right. So I also want to ask you about the section in the book on the Alamo, because I think many people, Mexican Americans, will tell you that learning about the Alamo in their school history class was the moment that they found out we were the bad guys. So I'm
Mm.
wondering if you could talk about how you address the Alamo in this book.
Yeah. Well, Texas is the only state in the United States that seceded twice, not once, but twice over the question of slavery. First, they seceded in 1836 because they didn't like it that Mexico had abolished slavery, and then later, of course, they seceded during the Civil War. Um, yeah, there have been all these stories glamorized by Disney, John Wayne and the Alamo, and yeah, absolutely, the Mexicans were these just backward, just these dirty, hapless people that had tried to uh, uh, defy, or they were led by this dictator Santana. They were the bad guys. But if you look closely at the story, you realize that that's part of the Texas creation myth. It really wasn't an independence movement. You call it the Texas independence. Independence means like what happened in Mexico, that the indigenous people and the Creoles who had lived there for generations got together and kicked out a foreign oppressor. In Texas, a lot of them had been there a few weeks. A lot of them were slave smugglers, like Jim Bowie. Um, all of them were slave owners. They were fighting not for the right to be free from an oppressor, as is often presented falsely in the Texas creation myth. They were fighting for the right to own other human people. And that's not the perspective that's usually taught in the school books.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, we have a question here, and I don't know that there's an easy answer to this, but let's share it. She says, "I'm trying to get all high schools in El Paso to offer Mexican American studies. What advice would you have?"
Um, there are already, for instance, there's a Mexican American Studies teacher at Jefferson High School, which is my alma mater. I went there. Um, and she invited me to give a talk. I know that there have been meetings. There was a Mexican American Studies professor at teacher at Franklin High School that organized other teachers, both from EPISD, El Paso Independent School District, and the surrounding, and even some of the college people and community college people. So maybe what I can do is I can leave a way to contact me, and maybe I can put her or put whoever's interested in touch with some of these Mexican American Studies professors, and that's how I think we need to do it. We all need to come together. As you know, books like mine right now aren't very popular in the state of Texas in terms of the Republicans and what they're trying to do with the censorship there. So I think as much solidarity, unity, organizing that we can do, the better, so that these stories won't be censored.
Yeah. Well, I do want to ask you about the publication. This was Penguin Random House, major publishing house, and how did they approach you? How did that happen? Because it's kind of hard for these kinds of stories to get picked up by big publishing houses.
It is. It is. So I was thankful that I was part of a series of books called Race for the Truth, and they had already done 3 other books. One of them was called Colonization and the Wampanoag story, the Native American story, then Slavery and the African American story, Inclusion and the Chinese American story. So they put out a call for historians, and they wanted us to submit 3 pages as a sample of whether or not we were capable of writing for a younger audience. It's hard for a lot of academic historians to do this, right? So that was the test, and I submitted a sample of the Bowie Dignity Strike of 1937. The Bowie High School in El Paso, where a whole bunch of students one morning, they just got up and walked out. It's probably the first major Mexican American walkout in the United States. And all they were doing was carrying a loaf of bread and a glass bottle of milk. And they went up to the newspapers, and their signs read, "We're not hungry," because there had been a series of articles during the Depression to help out the students of Bowie by putting them on the front page and showing that they were really hungry, and some of them, were fainting. Football players were fainting in the cafeteria, and it was a call to give money to help them out. And so that's a real interesting segment of the Depression on the border, because once again, why are they protesting something? It was this white audience didn't mean to demean them, but in a sense they had attacked their dignity. But it goes beyond that. It was in the middle of one of the largest ethnic cleansing campaigns in the United States, when about 2 million Mexicanos and their Mexican American children, 60% of them were U.S. born, were deported back to Mexico. So by being recipients of charity, that was grounds for excluding you from this country, right? So all of a sudden, charity becomes weaponized. And so I start off with this very simple story, and I put it in this broader context. So anyway, that was the 3-page sample of my writing, and they liked it. And I'm just really grateful to be part of this series, because basically they said, don't pull back, just tell the truth. We know that one of the books in this series has already been very creatively not totally banned. And so the one that has to do with the Native American story, it was put in the fiction section of a library in Montgomery, Texas. Oh. And that was a way of saying, this isn't history. Your history, the history of brown people is fiction. It's made up. It isn't real. So I'm very proud to be part of this series and this collection of books. So.
Is there anything you wish you had been able to fit into the book that didn't quite make it?
Oh, I submitted so many photographs. I love photographs. So in my first book, Ringside Seat to the Revolution, it actually started with me going down to the library, the El Paso Public Library, and finding these super fascinating photographs. And so to me, the combination of text and image and giving it almost equal weight. So I did submit a whole bunch of photographs, and they just wanted to give much more weight. And I can understand to the text, because there's, it's limited. And so I would have loved to see bigger photographs and more photographs, because I think it would have appealed to young people. I don't know if you agree, but I think Ringside Seat to Revolution, it was the photographs also that carried it.
Yeah, I will say that in Ringside Seat to a Revolution, some of the photographs are just things I had never seen before, but others, I think, particularly the part about the baths, it was just sort of shocking. Yeah. Eye-opening for sure. But also I think for this book, if you have if your family story includes the revolution, you've got to get this book because it's just going to illustrate that time period and what your family, could have experienced in a way that I think I hadn't really visualized before. But my family came because of the revolution, so I think it just resonated with that. It sort of filled in some visual gaps in what I know about that. Yeah.
So let me ask you this: was there any story in this newer book for young people that maybe you weren't familiar with, or that also made you think, "Wow"?
I'm sure that I'm not going to think of it, but maybe maybe part of the World War II story. I think that my knowledge of World War II is more my family's involvement, and then of course the Bracero program. But you have a story in here about a group of folks from Bowie High School, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I didn't know that story, and I think that it's those stories of military service that in some ways help people see how patriotic Mexican Americans have been for generations. I mean, going back to at least World War I, if not even earlier, because we had Tejanos in the Civil War. I mean,
Yeah. So that's one that I wondered if you had already. I think a lot of people don't know the huge importance, especially that Mexican Americans from New Mexico played in the Civil War. I mean, I don't know. Were you already kind of familiar with the importance of the? Because it's usually credited to this Officer Shivington for stopping the invasion of the Southerners led by the Texan cavalry, right? But not too many people know the importance of the New Mexican American volunteers in stopping that invasion.
I think honestly, I think that sometimes New Mexico just gets overlooked. So thank you for doing that. Because I think yeah, they get overlooked. Maybe because it took so long for them to become a state. I'm not sure. I don't know.
Yeah, and I started with the Pueblo Revolt, which
Yes.
scholars have called the first revolution in what is now the United States, right?
Yes. Yes. And a revolution that I think was eye-opening for other people under Spanish rule, right? That
Mm-hmm.
we can stand up to these folks. Yeah.
And actually defeat the imperialists, right? Even if they came back, it already planted a seed that they were not unbeatable. And like these thousands of slave revolts, even though they weren't ultimately absolutely successful, the Pueblo Revolt was successful for 12 years. They kicked out the middlemen, as they were called in the Tewa language, right? I love that metaphor. And then the corn mother returns. So I try to capture the poetry of the ways of thinking, especially indigenous ways of thinking, and the resilience, the struggles. So yeah, all of these stories are usually left out of the American story. Why? Because American history is usually told from east to west, right? It's the Pilgrims' land. They have Thanksgiving, then they move west. You forget about the Indians, and then later you see them with the Apaches and the Wild West stories, right?
Mm-hmm.
What if you tell the story both north south and south north? Because it's always been what I guess you call a transnational back and forth story, and that's very different than even the migration story where you land at Plymouth Rock and you cross an ocean and you leave everything behind. Here, migration just means movement, and that movement has been going on for thousands of years. So it's fundamentally a different story. And so the origin story is no longer Plymouth Rock. It is this passageway, this crossing along the border. So several crossings, right? So so to me, that's that's trying to explore the depth of a different model of understanding the American origin story, even slavery, right? We think that slavery begins in 1619. No, there was already indigenous slavery, the other slavery, as some scholars have called it, going on
Mhm.
way before that. But that's not told as an integral part of the story. Why not? Because there's a deliberate erasure. It's like people want to just zap your memory. Um, if you don't have a story, it's easier to conquer you. That's why in my book I write that the first thing that the American invaders did when they arrived to El Paso del Norte was go to the Misión de Guadalupe and burn a huge part of, especially the land deeds, um, in the archives, because you can't prove that this was your land. You can't prove your presence, and that's something that's repetitive. You
Mhm.
want to zap our memories so that you can't say we belong here. This is our land. Our land used to be communal lands. Um, so there's a deliberate erasure. It's like a deliberately inflected wound.
Yeah. I do just want to say I know we've mentioned a few questions and comments from
Mhm.
the chat, and um, if you still have a question, we still have a few minutes, and you can put your question in the chat. I just want to also acknowledge that we have people joining us from Dallas, El Paso, Chicago, San Antonio. I'm probably missing somebody. I apologize. But thank you for joining from wherever you're joining from today. And let me just see. A lot of folks excited about this book and interested in picking it up, and particularly thanking you for recognizing El Paso's role in this history. Let's see. I think I'm just trying to make sure I haven't uh, missed anyone's pressing question. Oh, will you be writing more books on Mexican American history?
Yes, absolutely. I would like to write a book. Once again, El Paso is my specialty, and I don't think the story of El Paso itself, how important it is in turning the American history, the official American history books upside down, right? Uh, what I was saying, what does the United States look like if you think of the line north and south, south and north? So I want to tell the story of El Paso both as a personal, family, collective, and a global story. That's one of
Mhm.
them. I did finally reach out to um, an agent. Well, it's actually the same agent that represented me for this book, and and she's suggesting that nobody, even though there's some great fiction writing or academic writing about Teresita Urrea,
Uh-huh.
Santa de Cabora, that I tell the story about the border combined with her story and the story of Lauro Aguirre, and they were both kind of these revolutionary collaborators. So
Yeah.
that's another story that I'm looking into as well.
Okay. Yeah. You do bring up Teresita
Mhm.
Urea in here, and that I think I think that's the kind of story that works well for people of different ages, just because her story starts when she's young.
Yeah,
Yeah. That would be a really great thing. I keep thinking that she's going to become a movie one day,
yeah,
but we'll see. We'll see.
yeah, and and,
Yeah.
and and some good fiction has been written about her, and but
Mhm.
yeah, I think there's so much more to tell about her story. I remember just being enraptured when I wrote Ringside Seat to the Revolution, and just visiting every single archive where there was anything about her, and there's reams and reams of information. But both in this book and Ringside, I could only use it as a chapter because she's not the focus.
Mm,
But there's a
right,
lot more that has not been written about her.
right. Well, is there anything else you want to share with us about this book, or what we should be looking for in terms
Well,
of books about Mexican American history?
well, I wrote a couple of paragraphs, three paragraphs for the introduction. Do you mind if I read the introduction?
Absolutely.
So, Mexican Americans have sometimes been called the forgotten people. They are the people who have disappeared through the cracks, the in between people. They don't fit in one category or stay in one place. They cross borders, although they originally didn't cross the border, rather, the border crossed them. Their ancestors have been living in what is now the American Southwest long before it became part of the United States. Much of Mexican American history has been ignored or erased. In recent years, white politicians and school board officials in some southwestern states like Arizona and Texas have prohibited students from learning the full truth about Mexican Americans. They are afraid that if students find out about this history, they might ask difficult questions. These politicians and officials say learning the truth about the past might cause division and bad feelings. The Mexican American students who learn about injustice in the past might get angry. They might want to change how things have always been done. Sometimes people want to forget the bad parts of history, both those who are ashamed of what they did and those who suffered through it. Sometimes learning about history hurts. It feels like a wound. But if we want to heal from these wounds, we first have to learn the truth. We have to remember.
I just want to say, I think this book would make an excellent holiday gift if you have any young readers in your family. But honestly, I think this is a good intro book to Mexican history for anybody over, you don't have to be 13, 14 years old for this book. It really is well done. Congratulations, Dr. Romo.
Thank you. Thank you. I really
Yeah.
appreciate that. And yeah, I mean, I guess what I want to say is that I was trying to find the balance between telling the story unflinchingly of the injustices that our community has suffered, because as I say in the introduction, that's part of the healing. I wanted to connect us with our indigenous history. So, like I write in the introduction that even though you thought you have no connection, when you speak Spanish and you use words like elote or coyote or moyote or tecolote, tomate, aguacate, you're actually speaking an indigenous language, right? Nahuatl.
Mhm.
And a lot of us trace our ancestry, I myself, to Mexica, to the Huichol. Um, but we're not giving permission to connect. There's this idea of like maybe it's cultural appropriation that's not really your heritage. You shouldn't claim to be native. And I disagree. I mean, there's a difference between cultural appropriation that you have nothing to do with the culture and cultural reappropriation to reconnect. So I'm
Mhm.
thinking that when people have called us mongrels, and I write about that in the book, or half breeds, they're saying that if you're only of mixed ancestry and your indigenous DNA is only 40% or 50 or 60%, that you have lost your right to say, I'm native. These are my lands. And that was something that was done intentionally. And I write about it in the book by the US Army. Because if they call you white, it's not really because you're white. So that's the only thing that you're allowed to fill out in an American census, right? You're white or another race or other forms. It's in order to disconnect you from your lands so that you can't say, this is my home also. These are my lands. So it reminds me of Naomi Osaka, who is part African American and part Japanese. And in Japan, they call her a hafu, which means half. And somebody said, that's kind of very degrading. She's not a hafu. She's a dapu, double, like almost like the indigenous two spirit. Because 1+1 is not half. 1+1 is 2. So you can be fully indigenous and fully Hispanic of Spanish descent. And you have every right to reclaim that because there was spiritual violence done to us as a community generations back. And we don't always have to live with that erasure and that cancellation, right? So that part of the book for me is really, really important, to give ourselves permission to reclaim and to reconnect to our indigeneity, no matter what other people say. And I'm willing to get into debates with other people about that, right? But that is like a super important part of my book. And not too many people may have picked up on it, but that's what I'm trying to say. And that's why I start with the indigenous period.
Wonderful. That's so powerful. Thank you so much for sharing that. Dr. Romo, it's been a pleasure. We're coming up at the end of the hour, but this has really just been a lovely conversation. I see people saying they're going to pick up the book and looking forward to getting their copy. Really, it is really a lovely book, and he's got maps and he's got pictures and all kinds of cool things in here. And very accessibly written. So I think this is the kind of thing that, you know, if you have a teenager, niece, nephew, child, get them this, and then you can have a conversation about it afterwards. Maybe not too much conversation. You don't want to weird them out, but they're sensitive at that age. Okay.
Yeah. I saw a question somebody asked me about, oh yeah, they wanted to remind people that it selected, it was one of the top 10 audio books of the year of 2024. And her name is Victoria Villarreal, I believe. She's an actor from Los Angeles.
Oh.
And people say that, I mean, she has the voice to, I don't know. So they like the audio version of it. So that's another thing. I mean, some people, unfortunately, might not have time to read the whole thing, but I also recommend the audiobook.
If you have to drive somewhere for the holidays, maybe you should listen to that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you again, everyone, for being here with us tonight. I want to, of course, thank our funders, including the City of San Antonio, Department of Arts and Culture, Bexar County, the Mellon Foundation, the John L. Santikos Charitable Foundation Fund of the San Antonio Area Foundation, Spurs Give, Wells Fargo, and individual donors like you. Mil gracias for your support. If you like tonight's presentation, we have more events coming up. Actually, Saturday, we are doing a pop-up at Holidays on Houston Street, which is but we are physically going to be in Travis Park, which is part of the Holidays on Houston Street. We're going to be there with our Alonso Perales exhibit. Alonso Perales, important civil rights lawyer from San Antonio, or based in San Antonio, and he actually officed on Houston Street. So we'll be right down the street from where he used to office. We'll have the exhibit on display. We'll also be making civil rights themed holiday ornaments, and it's free. You can just come and join us and do that. We'll be there from 2 to 9 on Saturday. And then we're taking a little vacation for the holidays, but we'll be back in January with more events. You can always find out about our upcoming events on our website, somosmacri.org. And did you know we're building the nation's first museum dedicated to Mexican American civil rights history? Yes, we're on a long road to get there. We need your support. If you go to our website, you can find out more information. You can subscribe to our newsletter. You can follow us on social media, all of those things. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Romo. It was wonderful to be here.
Thank you, Sarah, for like the tremendous work that you're doing. And you do it with so much enthusiasm. And I felt really honored to be here today with you. And this was a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay. Good night, everybody. Stay warm. It's a little chilly in Texas today. Have a good night.